On this episode of Wilder Wolves, we are reacting to the Timberwolves defeating the Portland Trailblazers 118 to 114, notably discussing Anthony Edwards' dominant 41-point performance, the last second point guard change, starting Donte DiVincenzo over Mike Conley, and also why the Portland Trailblazers were a fantastic game one test for this Timberwolves team. It's going to be an exciting episode, so let's get started. Welcome to Wilder Wolves, Hall of Fame mode fandom. My name is Wilder Adams, and the Minnesota Timberwolves 1-0, starting the season incredibly strong, beating a Portland Trailblazers team 118 to 114. And this was a game that you look at the Portland Trailblazers and you see a team that isn't historically that good the last couple years. But this was not going to be an easy game for the Timberwolves because this Blazers team matches up so well against us. One, they're underrated. I just think they're an underrated basketball team because that size, that physicality, that array of perimeter defenders, that ball pressure with Drew Holiday, Kamara, Avdia, Thibault, they have a plethora of guys that can throw out Minnesota. And that is a problem usually for Minnesota. So even though this was a game where Minnesota should have been favored to win, this was a great matchup for the Timberwolves. With that size, with that physicality, they were going to pressure all the weaknesses that this Timberwolves team has and might have throughout the season. And we saw that, and it wasn't a pretty game. Portland led the majority of the game. Pretty much the first, I would say, 40 minutes, it felt like Minnesota, every time they scored and got closer, Portland kept pushing forward. Portland was overachieving offensively the first three quarters with some of their shooting. I mean, Jeremy Grant was absolutely unconscious. Avdia played well, and they just shot incredibly well for Portland standards. Like, this isn't a team that you expect to be as dynamic offensively the first 36 minutes as Portland was. But Minnesota, they stayed persistent. They continued pushing forward despite Portland and the turnovers they kept forcing Minnesota, the 19 turnovers. There was a huge foul disparity between Portland and Minnesota. I think Portland had 11 more free throws, 12 more fouls than Minnesota. So all the things that Portland were going to press in this game, they did. And Minnesota still won the game, which I think was an incredibly great sign that they were able to do that. And before we really dive into it, I think you guys can tell, like looking at the background in my room, I am not in my normal studio location right now because I wish I was in Portland covering the game, but I'm not in Portland. I'm actually in Reno, Nevada right now, cheering on my little sister, Maisie Adams, at Teen USA or Miss USA, as she is Teen Miss Minnesota. So before we really get into it, I want you guys to give her your best wishes as she performs. It was actually a really funny way the timing lined up because her performance yesterday afternoon was around 3 o'clock Pacific time, which is 5 o'clock Minnesota time. And the Portland game was at 7. So I was able to watch the game. And, you know, being a brother, I'm happy I didn't have to go to my sister and be like, yeah, I'm sorry I didn't come to your thing, but I had to watch the Trailblazers play basketball. But it all worked out. We're here. And the first thing I want to talk about for why Minnesota won this game, Anthony Edwards is really flipping good at basketball, and he's continuing to ascend as a mega star. And this game was a huge sign of that. Portland had everything to throw at him for three quarters. They had three all-league defenders plus Denny Avdia that they could throw at him consistently, but Anthony Edwards was efficient and, more importantly, he was decisive as a creator. Obviously, he's looking like he's moving different, like the burst of speed, the handles tighter. That was great. But what really stood out to me was his decisiveness as a decision maker, as a shot maker, and even as a playmaker. People will say like Anthony Edwards only had one assist, so he wasn't a great passer. But when you look at the shots that he passed that led to a hockey assist, or even some assists that should have been assists, but they were missed by teammates, I thought I thought his decision making was quality from top to bottom. It felt like, and this is the big step for Anthony Edwards this year. When teams take away Anthony Edwards spots historically, of course, like most players, it affects his production because he's never had that consistent go-to spot. But Portland kept throwing pressure at him. He always had a counter. He knew exactly when to get to the rim, and he can slice and dice and get to the paint at a level that he even didn't do in the past because that handle's tighter. He could also now get to that mid-range consistently, and he's talked about wanting to work on that all summer. And there's always a fear with Edwards. He's like, I'm going to work on my three-point shot, and all he's going to do is shoot threes and show what he worked on. But he showcased his work as a mid-range scorer, not with only the shot making, which was great, but it always felt like he was shooting it at the right time. He got to the mid-range spot when the defense took away everything. If he couldn't get to the rim, if he couldn't get to the three, that's when he got to the mid-range. When it was late in the game and you know Portland's going to try to take away his toughest spots, he had a spot to get to and win the game, right? With less than 10 seconds left, Anthony Edwards on the left wing penetrates and then takes a step back mid-range shot, wins the game essentially. Edwards is showcasing he is developing go-to spots on the basketball court, which are only going to make him that much more dangerous because, of course, you can't stay in front of the guy athletically and you have to pressure him when shooting threes. But now when you try to do both, he can get to the mid-range and whatever he does on the court, better chance than not, he's going to make a good decision. That's what's going to separate Anthony Edwards from the fifth, sixth, seventh best player to arguably a top three player in the league. That decision making as a three-level scorer and as an overall two-way player in this game was a great sign. And Joe Ingles talked about it. The difference between this game at the end of the game when Minnesota went on a 23-11 run to close the game out, Minnesota had the best player. Minnesota had Anthony Edwards. Portland didn't. And when you play teams that are tough matchups like Portland with that defense, you need your superstar to kind of bandage everything else. And that's exactly what Anthony Edwards did. And if Anthony Edwards can consistently be the decision maker he was in the clutch this game, Minnesota's clutch offense is going to be that much better because they were 20-26 in clutch time last year. They're 1-0 this year now, and they could be much better late in the season, which could be the difference between a top 2 or 3 seed from Minnesota and a 6 seed. So Edwards, it's only one game, but I thought the decision-making and I thought the overall performance was so incredibly encouraging. So there's nothing you can say about Anthony Edwards after this game. He was spectacular. But then I also think let's transition to something that's a little less positive. The ball handling issues are continuing to look pretty problematic for this Timberwolves team. And it really started, unfortunately, with the starting point guard change. They start Donte DiVincenzo over Mike Conley this game. And I think that's going to be continuous going forward. And I do think it's the right decision to start Donte over Mike Conley because we've talked about it on the show. I love Mike Conley. I love what he brought to the team the first couple years. We all love his character. He's had a fantastic career. But it was very clear last year he's not the same player as he was. 21% in the conference finals, didn't really show much in the preseason. It's just at this point, unfortunately, if you're starting Mike Conley, you're probably not serious as a contender. So shout out to Chris Finch. Shout out to Mike Conley as well for his humility, allowing the team to make the right decision and change starting point guard. Now, the point guard position is limited on this team, right? Rob Dillingham, we'll talk about him later, didn't play this game. And also, Bones Highland, not a starter. They start Donte DiVincenzo, which was a very fair decision. And I don't think it was the wrong decision today. But I do think Donte starting showcased the cons of starting a Donte DiVincenzo. As great as Donte is as an off-ball decision maker, as a shooter, he is limited for a ball handler for his size. And Portland pressured him. They pressured him. They turned him over multiple times in transition. He had 6 turnovers in the game, 7 points, and they really spooked him. He really struggled with it. And with Donte starting, that's just going to be a problem when you play specific matchups like this. I think when Donte plays the Lakers on Friday, he's probably going to be much better because honestly, like 25 of the 30 NBA teams aren't going to provide enough on ball pressure to really bother Minnesota's ball handling limitations. But Portland's one of those 5, which is why they were a great matchup for Minnesota as a test. And it really exposed the Donte DiVincenzo problem at point guard. That's going to be the theme with this team this year. Where can the Minnesota Timberwolves find ball handlers who can reliably get the ball past half court? Of course, Anthony Edwards needs to be that, and I think he is. You need Randle to be that. But then it's like when you look at point guard, can Donte do it? Can Conley and Dillingham handle the physicality and the pressure to do it? Same with Bones. I mean, it's a big problem with this team, and this game really exposed that. 19 turnovers, and I don't know what the solution is going to be. As much as I love Donte as a player, and as much as I think he's going to show good signs, granted, in the first quarter, when they got him off ball, he had 7 points and he looked really good. And I think that's going to be a big advantage with starting Donte DiVincenzo this year. He's going to add an off ball dimension and an efficiency wide open and in motion that nobody else on the roster can. So as Anthony Edwards rises as a playmaker, Donte is going to be a big asset in those situations, but it wasn't yesterday. And the Timberwolves had silly turnovers throughout the game, really bothered by that Portland situation with how many guys they can throw at it. And it's just going to be a work in progress this year. That was a big con throughout the game. Minnesota really took care of that late in the game. And I think a lot of that gives credit to Randle and Edwards. And also, I think a part of that, which nobody's going to talk about, I think Terrence Shannon helps with that too, because Shannon has those playmaking chops, but he also has a physicality where he's not as bothered by Portland compared to other people. Of course, he's not perfect. He's going to not always be the most paced ball handler, changing of speeds, slowing things down. But I do think having Shannon late in the game over Donte DiVincenzo, who I would have had as a starter, by the way. I've said it throughout the offseason. I would have Shannon start over anybody, including Conley and Donte. But maybe that's a future thing. But I do think that made a big difference late. And I think Portland, they exposed that problem. Now, how will Minnesota figure it out? Hopefully, Rob Dillingham could eventually be a part of that solution with how tight and crisp his handle is. But it was a problem. It really was a problem. And I think that's a fair way to transition to that point guard situation. Not only Donte starting, but Rob Dillingham not playing as well. And this didn't necessarily shock me for most of the game because, I mean, Chris Finch talked about it in previous media days. He said players like Shannon, Clark, Dillingham, that ninth-ish man, those guys will be in situationally on the right matchups. In Portland, with how big and physical they are, I see why they didn't lean into having Conley and Rob Dillingham off the bench. That wasn't the question. What stood out to me more, though, was the fact when Minnesota needed more ball handling early in the fourth quarter, and Bones Highland was the player who subbed in over Rob Dillingham. That's when, my siren went off a little bit. Chris Finch, after the game, said Bones provides a little more size and maybe more defensive ability over Rob, which is why he did it. And I'm not sure how much I buy that because, with all due respect to Bones Highland, I think if he was a more trustworthy defender at the NBA level, he would have probably a $15 million contract right now. So I'm not sure how much I buy that Chris Finch response. So a part of me is kind of worried about what's going on with Rob Dillingham. The fact that he wasn't in the rotation tonight and they went to Bones Highland over Dillingham. I don't know what's going on there. I think he had a better few games at the end of preseason. I think we'll have a more definitive answer on what's going on there when the Lakers game happens, because the Lakers, I would say, are a more favorable matchup for Rob Dillingham. But the fact they didn't play him is still, I'm raising an eyebrow there. I don't know what's going on. Is he out of the rotation? I don't know. Chris Finch hasn't said he is, but actions speak louder than words, and it's only one game. So we'll see going forward. But I definitely have my antenna when it comes to watching the Rob Dillingham situation, whether he is going to be a legit rotation player or not. And if not, as the 8th overall pick in his second year, that's good. That's a little concerning. That's a little concerning. And I think that'll lead to bigger conversations. It's game one. We're after game one. So I'm maybe getting ahead of myself. But if this game was a sign of what's to come with the Rob Dillingham situation, I bet we'll hear a lot more about it toward February at the deadline and then some. So I don't think Finch made the wrong decisions necessarily. I said a couple weeks ago that Dillingham hasn't necessarily proven that he is one of the 8 or 9 best players on the team, but the fact that he isn't playing at all, that's something to watch. So, yeah, I think this game was a great opportunity for Minnesota to navigate those ball handlers, the lack of ball handlers, kind of work around that, and they were able to for the most part. And also, I think it's really encouraging that Minnesota, they out-rebounded Portland significantly despite the physicality. Of course, which I thought was nonsense. I thought Portland had that Oklahoma City Thunder type thing where they were overly aggressive and then they would flop at the end and somehow get the call. But then on the other end, Minnesota, if they match that physicality, they get a call against them, which is why I thought the foul count was so skewed. But I think the fact Minnesota handled that the way they did was incredibly encouraging. And I also think another couple of notes on this game, Jaden McDaniels was fantastic. 18 points, 5 for 11 from the field, 3 for 4 from 3. And Jaden McDaniels, what was really encouraging was the 3-point shot. Yeah, a lot of players have a good 3 for 4 a game from 3 once in a while, and maybe it's an exception for Jaden. I don't know. But watching Jaden McDaniels shoot those threes that game was really encouraging to me, because Jaden, every time I watch him in the past, his upper body motion is fluid as a shooter, but it was the lower body that looked a little stiff. It looked like there was a high hesitation on his shots when he was shooting threes. And this game, he was doing movement threes. He was doing corner threes. He hit a key corner three in the fourth quarter when Minnesota started to take over. And it just looked decisive. It looked fluid. You can tell he's been working on that jumper. All of his shots, he got 18 in the flow of the offense. He didn't take away from Randle. He didn't take from Ant. He didn't take from anybody. Everything was in the flow. It was decisive. And it was building on, like, Jaden the last half of last year was averaging over 15 points per game. And it felt like a continuation of that. And if Jaden McDaniels can continue being that guy who can give you a non-demanding 17 points for a team that needs to have more creators, that's going to make such a big difference. One, for Jaden McDaniels short term, but also long-term trajectory for this squad. So I really loved what I saw from Jaden. Of course, he had the foul trouble issues early in the third quarter. And I thought what was really good about that, actually, Jaden was able to still be effective offensively and not be too phased by the foul trouble he showcased this game. We saw last year, we saw in the past, Jaden sometimes, if he gets into foul trouble, that's the end of Jaden. That's a 6-point game for Jaden. That's a 4-point game. The moment you get him into foul trouble, you take him out offensively. But that wasn't the case. He got his north of 10 field goals, and historically, Minnesota is nearly unbeatable when Jaden McDaniels gets over 10 shots in a game, and he was productive. So Jaden McDaniels was encouraging. Julius Randle also very in the flow, was efficient, nailing his threes, allowing Ant to do his thing, and he was still getting his buckets. I thought it was pretty encouraging that Randle was able to feel comfortable as a playmaker, as a scorer, his ability to get that extra step at the rim, his footwork really stood out. Julius Randle, if you get that version of Julius Randle, you are going to win a lot of games. So the fact that Minnesota, and I suspect this going to happen, the fact that Minnesota's three best players, in my opinion, this year were able to be that productive, I think it kind of canceled out a lot of the issues that Minnesota had with those turnovers, with the foul disparity. And if those three can be consistent doing that, Minnesota will be able to cancel out a lot of those issues. I also think Terrence Shannon Jr. today was really, really good, or last night in the second half. Wasn't comfortable in the first half. I'm not sure if he scored in the first half in 11 minutes. But then second half, 10 points, 5 rebounds, 5 assists. The jump shot continues to look money, building off of Summer League, building off of preseason. The decision making, I legitimately think Terrence Shannon is one of the best passers on the team. I legitimately believe that. He consistently now, with high responsibility, can get you 4 or 5 plus assists and also do that while being efficient offensively. I have really high hopes for Terrence Shannon. And I think the fact that Terrence showed up like this against a team like Portland, I think it's a really good sign when Minnesota faces in the future some of those bigger, more physical teams like a Dallas, like an Oklahoma City, like an Indiana, where sure, Minnesota, they'll struggle with Conley and Dillingham and Donte and those guys more often than not, in my opinion, but they can counter that with a dude like Terrence Shannon, and he also still provides that playmaking dimension. I wonder if there's ever a point where he does get a starting opportunity, because I think there's a real chance he'll prove to be good enough to do that. It's early in the season. He's way less proven than Donte DiVincenzo, but I think that world is possible for him if his consistency and the sample size continue to increase. So Terrence Shannon, I thought was a really good sign. And this Minnesota Timberwolves team overall, was it a perfect game? No, it was not. The turnovers were bad. And I think there was a part of that. Minnesota's been very intentional about trying to increase the speed of this offense. And we saw multiple like transition, full court passes. Some of them worked. Edwards got a couple of them, but also some of them didn't work. Late in the third quarter, they try to force one in transition, and then the Blazers score. It was a pass from Naz Reid. Or there's one early in the game as well where they like try to pass it to, I think, Rudy late in the game. And then it didn't work either. So some of these turnovers weren't only just Portland, stripping the ball from our playmakers or ball handlers, but I think it's also a sign of work in progress as Minnesota shifts their identity toward more a faster paced offense, a more intentionally quick offense. And this is the time of the year to figure that out. Lean into that, get those turnovers out of the way. So by the time January, February begin, you are able to play fast. You are able to play slow. You're multidimensional, which Minnesota's offense hasn't been historically. So I think it's okay we went through those lumps that game. I think it's fantastic that Minnesota, despite those lumps, were able to win. I think Edwards, the ability to continue dominating despite the pressure and have those go-to spots for mid-range, I thought it was a great sign this game, what this could develop into down the road. The point guard position is going to be a question, but Minnesota being able to navigate that with efficient scoring from your three best players and also rebound incredibly well. Clutch time offense was money for Minnesota standards. I thought overall it was a very net positive game for Minnesota, and Portland answered a lot of questions and exposed questions for Minnesota going forward because they have the salt in Portland to pour into the wounds of this Minnesota team. Now, on Friday, Minnesota is in LA. They're playing the Los Angeles Lakers. And this Lakers team, I think, matches up more favorably toward Minnesota because they have less to throw at in the perimeter. They're not as deep. I don't think the Lakers are very good, but Luka's fantastic. That's the one kryptonite on that Lakers squad. So we will react to that Lakers game in the future. But until then, thank you all so much for listening to this episode of Wilder Wolves. It was a pleasure having you on for the first recap episode of Wilder Wolves history. Minnesota on a good start, 1-0, taking down the Portland Trailblazers. Thank you all so much for listening. I will see you soon. This is Wilder Wolves, Hall of Fame mode fandom.